What is up, Coordination? On the pod today, we've got Gnoman, who is an entrepreneur and philosopher who is working on creating the Regenaissance. So this podcast is covering a lot of ground. It's covering the Regenaissance, a meta-modern playbook, which is a Google document that Gnoman has authored. We also talk about Holos, which is a Holonic community computer, white paper that Gnoman wrote. And also, it's not just white paper. There's actually a Web3 social network that is where this is all happening. And then we also talk about Playdrive, which is an event that's coming up in June in Austria, where people can build at the intersection of these ideas. So how do we stimulate a Regenaissance is the scope of this episode with Gnoman. And I think that one of the things I just really enjoyed about this episode is just how articulate and lucid of a thinker that Gnoman is, and how well thought out these ideas are in full high resolution. I think you'll get that from listening to this episode. But this isn't just an episode about theory. This is also an episode about practicing the ideas that have been put out there. And so we talk about the importance of play and practicing play, flow states, and how we can engineer an internet that creates a little bit more of a Regenaissance. So I found this to be a really stimulating episode, and I think you will too. Enjoy.
ATHENA DAO is addressing the underfunded areas of women's health, such as menopause and endometriosis. ATHENA is a community-driven DAO, giving women a say in decision-making and funding the scientific breakthroughs that impact their lives. With cutting-edge technology like Molecule's IP NFT framework, they invest in research IP that ensures exclusive licensing rights. ATHENA DAO is raising awareness to women's health research, working alongside existing organizations. So, join ATHENA DAO today to help change the landscape of women's health research.
Gnoman, how you doing?
I'm doing pretty good, Kevin. What about you?
Oh, things are good. I'm pretty excited to get into all the things with you. Maybe we'll start with what is the Regenaissance?
Sure. The Regenaissance is a regenerative metagame that is being played from 2020 to 2030 with the goal of regenerating our planetary culture. It's a metagame.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah,
I was just going to ask, what does a metagame mean? And you're going right into it.
So a metagame is a game which generates games. It's a set of constraints around game design, which then allows you to iterate games inside of it.
Got it. And so, how does this metagame work? There's a document that I've got up, the Regenaissance, a meta-modern playbook. I'm curious if you could take us deeper.
Sure. So there are a few central elements to it. One of them is something which is called ancients, and ancients is the historical equivalent of presence. So just as we need to be present so we can connect with what is happening around us, we also need to cultivate this capacity for ancients, which is the process of social archaeology to discover what are the profound, forgotten ways of communal living which we need to resuscitate to revivify our culture. So ancients is one element, and the Regenaissance talks in particular about the festivals of play, which used to happen in ancient Rome and ancient Greece, which would be prolonged holidays of 30, 60, sometimes 180 days, which would allow the population to enter into a deep state of non-labor flow. And during these festivals, they would celebrate all forms of gods and ceremonies, rituals, and play. And when I read about this, I was like, holy shit, this is the kind of social metabolism reset which we are craving for in a 365 24/7 culture, which never stops. And so in the Regenaissance, one of the main elements is this game called the turn. And the turn is a regenerative festival of play where multiple cities around the world coordinate with one another to compete who can regenerate their city the most. We've been doing this over the past couple of seasons. We do it seasonally. So we started in autumn 2022 in Amsterdam, and then we did winter in Amsterdam versus Berlin. And we just did the spring on Earth Day, where we did Amsterdam versus Berlin versus Brussels. And the idea being that over time we can coordinate simultaneously in different geographical locations these games of play which tap into these deep intrinsic drives within us, which can harness, for example, competition in a positive way, which is actually going to regenerate the culture and regenerate the planet.
So what I heard there was that there's this, in ancient Rome, they would have multi-week festivals of play, and it would be kind of like a social metabolism reset for the entire community, regenerate the spiritual and kind of social capital. And it was a holiday from work. And that was really regenerative. And so with the Regenaissance, what you're kind of doing is creating that in the modern era, in which many cities at a time can kind of cross-pollinate and do play within their local environments and have the same sort of spiritual and social reset. And then I also, this actually sort of drives me to the Playdrive event that you're having in June coming up. So could you tell us a little bit about the Playdrive event that you're organizing?
Sure. So Playdrive is an event which is taking place in the Austrian Alps at the Commons Hub. It's taking place from June 4th to June 11th. And at Playdrive, we're going to be playing with this idea of the global brain as a massively multiplayer game engine. So a game engine that thousands, millions of people could participate in simultaneously to cultivate this emerging superintelligence in a way that will allow us to all maximize our fields of play. The fundamental rule being that no game should destroy any other game. So nobody's fun should crush another player's fun. Now, to do that, there's the requirement for very subtle and profound coordination to make sure that there's a metagame which holds all of the games in space, which gives boundaries, guidelines, so that everybody can maximize their field of play while simultaneously without harming any of the other players. So we're bringing together a bunch of people who are interested in this idea of the global brain. I've heard Jordan Hall talk about the neocortex on this podcast.
Yep.
We like to call it the nuocortex, like the noosphere is emerging. So we want to play this idea into existence, and we want to do it through this modality of play, which for us is the intuitive mode of being, which allows for a maximum amount of metabolism of the present moment, and which has the emergent properties of novelty, which is what we require to continue to explore these increasing realms of depth and complexity, and harness all of that creativity, which is going to come out of that, to do some actual building of seeds of the global brain. So we're interested in building interfaces, we're interested in building toys, we're interested in building games that are going to facilitate this massively multiplayer social coordination around the globe.
So there'll be a link to Playdrive in the show notes, and if people are interested in checking it out, it's in June 4th in Austria. And just to connect some of these ideas to things that we've talked about on the Green Pill podcast, I see on the Playdrive website, it says the global brain can be thought of as kind of a collective intelligence of humans and all of their technological creations. So collective intelligence is something that we've talked about a lot on this podcast as a means of creating a more regenerative internet, a more democratic internet. When we have collective intelligence, we can solve for the preferences of the many and not just what the rich people want. And we're leveraging the new sphere. The new sphere is NOO sphere, and it's a term that was coined, I think, 40 or 50 years ago. Let me actually look it up right now. But it was like in the the Stallman era of the internet, like 30 or 40 years ago. It was I remember reading an essay about the new sphere, and that's when that term was coined. And so we're kind of bringing play into the new sphere, bringing these ancient ideas into the new sphere, and it's like this massively multiplayer online thing because of the collective intelligence. And it feels like you're just trying to hack on advancing the art of play, leveraging collective intelligence. And I don't know, that's sort of how it resonates in my brain. Am I coming close at all? Is there anything I missed?
Oh no, definitely. I just want to weave in this idea of ancients here again, and the role of the CI AI synergy, which also George Poor is doing some very interesting work on this. Of how do we synergize collective intelligence and artificial intelligence in a way that we can have the emergent property of collective wisdom, right, even beyond collective intelligence. And the role of ancients in how do we cultivate an artificial intelligence in a way where it is not stuck in the micro-historical metabolism of our current culture, which tends to be autocoprophagic, as they say, which means to eat its own shit. It's just eating the last thing which came out over and over and over and over and over, and in the end, it's making it sick. And so we need to go through this process of cultivating the past and making sure that so many of these cultural artifacts which have not yet been digitized, to digitize them in a way that we can then help cultivate these emerging superintelligences, because otherwise they're going to have these very shallow timeframes. And there's so much culture which is being lost and which is disappearing all over the world on so many different levels. And for the superintelligence to really grasp the whole fullness of what it means to be and how we can help channel that, then we have to participate in that process.
Yeah. Well, I feel like this might be a good point to pivot into talking about Weco, which is a Holonic social network that you're involved in building. And as we make that pivot, as I guide the conversation there, I just want to say that some of the people that I've really tried to seek out to be on this podcast check a couple of these different boxes. One is that they're skilled in talking about the theory and their theory of change and their theory of civilization. And the second is that they're able to build community around that. And, I see that with the Regenaissance that you're building in Playdrive. But the third part is actually creating that change and building technological levers towards that change and creating the empirical feedback that they're testing their ideas against actual data. And for me, that's where it gets really interesting with Weco and your idea of a Holonic community computer. So can we go there? Can you tell us about Weco and how Holons fit in and how you're building kind of different social network that's going to facilitate this change in its full breadth and depth online?
Sure. So Weco is a Holonic social network. What the word Holonic means comes from the word, the ancient Greek word holon, which means something which is simultaneously a part and a whole in and of itself. So a simple example is if you take the human body is a whole in and of itself, but then it's composed of organs. And an organ is a whole in and of itself, but then it's composed of cells. And a cell is a whole in and of itself, but then it's composed of subcomponents. So it's this idea that things are, as far as we can tell, ontologically nested. As far as we perceive, this seems to be a fundamental aspect of the structure of being. And so my friend James Weir had been studying Holonics and came up with the idea of creating a social network which would have these properties. And what it would allow people to do is to create communities which have subcommunities, which have subcommunities, which have subcommunities, and thereby aggregating all of the content into their higher level categories and allowing people to choose what specific level of granularity do they want to explore. But beyond that, beyond nesting, what you can do with Holonics is that you can nest a community within multiple other communities, which doesn't have to be a direct hierarchical leveling. It's what they call a holarchy. And in a holarchy, you can have a community which is part of multiple other communities simultaneously, which are going off in different branches of this emerging network. And that's where this idea of Holos and the community computer, the Holonic community computer, comes in, which is, what if we were to have a holarchy of many different communities, and each of these communities could define, using ledgers, blockchain, but also holochain, roll-ups, if they could define their own economics, governance, and culture in a way that their sub-communities would inherit of those guidelines. If that was a hierarchy, then it would be simple, because you would just have a parent-to-child inheritance. But if you have a holarchy where any community can have multiple parents from multiple different communities, then that has the emergent property of complex negotiations of any community saying that, okay, I have multiple affiliations. I am part of multiple wholes simultaneously. I'm not owned by anything in particular, but I have these symbiotic relationships. How do I negotiate? Which rules do I respond to? If there are differing rules on from the two parents, then how do I coordinate myself? Okay, that's going to require some coordination between the parents as well to figure that out. And then the child is going to have to figure out, okay, do I do 70% this one, 30% this one? And so that starts to reflect how communities actually exist in real life and how people are part of communities. We're all part of multiple communities simultaneously. Communities are part of multiple communities simultaneously. And so we need to be able to coordinate in that kind of style.
Yeah. So let me say what you said back to you. And I just like to repeat, these ideas get complicated, so I want to repeat them back for the audience. So a holon is something that is simultaneously whole in and of itself, but also as part of a larger whole. Like, I'm a human, and, beneath the level of holon that is humanity, I have my organs and my cells, and above macro, above my humanity, you and I are both humans, and together we form the holon that is this podcast. But the Holon above that is maybe the green pill or regenerative crypto economic movement. And the Holon above that is all of crypto. And then there's, let's just say the whole earth is a Holon above that. And that stack is called the holarchy, the stack of connections between Holons. So there's like a vertical stack that goes from like cell, organ, organism, ecosystem, biosphere, but there's also adjacent Holons that are stacked sort of like adjacent to each other. And so what I like about this Holonic worldview is that it sort of breaks the dualism of individualism versus collectivism, which is where I feel like a lot of our conversations get stuck when it comes to creating social change. Do we favor the individual or the collective? But I also think that it allows us to create like different levels of complexity where we can manage a movement for social change, or we can manage resource allocation. And it's like it allows us to, I'm almost imagining like pinching and zooming into different holonic social networks that create all of the social networks that are the internet. And if you can operate at the right level of Holon, the aperture for the change that you're creating, but also pinch and zoom in and pinch and zoom out, you'll be able to see the effects on adjacent communities from there. So it's just an elegant architecture for thought that allows you to think about social change at multiple different levels. And that's why I think the idea of a holonic community computer is really important. Like, in a way, social networks are holonic community computers, but we just don't think of them that way. And you consciously designing a holonic, like a kind of a social network around this idea of holons, is a really interesting scaffolding for me in building social change in Web3. So hopefully the audience now at this point knows what holons and holarchy are, but I'd love to dive in on the holonic community computer a little bit more next. What are you building? What is Weco, and how can people use it today?
Yeah, so as I said, Weco is a holonic social network, but we also like to call it holonic playnet. And this opposition between the playnet and the network, I think, is a very fertile one of always thinking of work at the core of our society, inverting that and rather putting play at the core, and a playnet being the social infrastructure which holds the players so that they can maximize their field of play. Maximizing their field of play so that they can explore as many niches as possible, generate as much as novelty as possible, and thereby increasing the collective intelligence of the society. So we take that approach at Weco. Simultaneously, we're building tools for things like governance, for decision-making, but we're also building toys for people to play. Because we believe that before you can build a polis, you need to generate propolis. A propolis is a really interesting term, which is the glue which holds the beehive together. Mm-hmm. And it has all these interesting properties of, it serves for the immune system of the hive. If a lizard comes in to the hive, then they'll wrap it in propolis, so it prevents it from infecting the whole of the hive, and it can then be removed. So it's a really fascinating substance. But it also means pro before polis, the community. And the idea of propolis in the realm of play is that before you can start building a community, before you can start making hard decisions that cut through communities, you need to build rapport. You need to build intimacy. And you do that through play. You do that by taking turns. So taking turns, one of the fundamental units of game design, allows people to very rapidly generate reciprocity. Even if it's symbolic, just the going back and forth of taking turns accelerates the generation of reciprocity. And because of all that, we've developed what we call the glass bead game, which is a game of taking turns to explore together the topics which concern us all in a culture. So, for example, we would take the topic of regeneration, and we would play 1 minute turns on a timer. So it's exactly 1 minute. So equal reciprocity, which also has this property of this resonance of equality, which is generated from the form of the game. And we take turns to explore this topic, intentionally trying to interconnect what we're saying with one another, so that we're always deepening the resonances that we're generating. And we try and avoid the use of I and you, so we can bypass our egos and enter into this collective intelligence. Mm-hmm. And we really try and state our truth, the part of the truth which we are holding on to. And by doing that, you can very quickly generate rapport between people, and you can very quickly come to collective insight. And once you start entering into the flow state of the going and back and forth, you can reach that point when you're speaking faster than you can think, and that's when the novelty is being generated. And that's the goal. The goal is the novelty. Mm-hmm. But then beyond that, there are also the emergent properties of the play, which is the propolis, the rapport which is being generated through the gameplay, but also the generation of a common culture, of a common understanding. If you have a community and they choose a topology, a set of topics which concern them all, and everybody within that community plays with everybody else on those topics and have come to a common understanding, when the community meets at a whole, you no longer are dragged down by people asking, oh, but what do you mean by society? What do you mean by the law? You've already gone through all of that groundwork or that ground play to come to a common understanding. And then when you're actually starting to play the polis, then everybody has a deep level of understanding with one another, and it allows you to massively accelerate that process.
Beautiful. So I'm just going to play back what you said in my own words, and hopefully the audience hearing it from two different styles will help it set a little bit more. So a polis is like a city-state, and propolis is like the infrastructure between city-states that helps them hold together. And, you know, we also made the analogy of like a beehive. So in a beehive, propolis is the resin-like material made by bees that sort of like holds it together, and it creates, I almost want to feel like a structure of anti-fragility in between different parts of the hive. And so you're saying that in our global interconnected society, what we should be doing is investing in creating like a propolis. If we're going to talk about this, I should learn to pronounce that word. But that's where if you can invest in those social relationships and sort of like mutualism between players, that creates a certain anti-fragility in the system. But it also is where collective intelligence comes from. That moment that you said where your mouth is moving faster than your mind is sort of where generation comes from. Maybe there's sort of like a flow state that's entered within a community in which they're playing together. So that's how I perceive what you said. But is there anything you'd correct or you think is too reductionist or anything in how I said that back to you?
Well, you raised the interesting point of the propolis not only being between individual players within a community, but also being within across communities. And that's what we're trying to do with the turn, by getting multiple cities, multiple communities to synchronize simultaneously. Then you're building rapport in between the different geographies.
Yeah.
And there's a whole infrastructure which already exists to facilitate this, which is twinned cities. So all around the world, any city of pretty much any size will be twinned with other cities in other countries. Sometimes they just have one twin, but sometimes they have 2, 3, 4, 5 different twins in different locations. And I've always dreamt of tapping into those pre-existing relationships to do this turn taking of communal regeneration, wherein one of the cities, a group of players from that city would go into the other city and help regenerate it during the turn. And then the next turn, that city could send a group of players to the city which originally sent the players. And so you would have this cross-pollination of all these regenerative players around the world who would be bringing their intelligence, that would be bringing their wisdom and building bridges across large geographical locations. And you could even imagine things like, and this is explored in the Atlas game in the Regenaissance document, you could even imagine something called a cashback. So cash here spelled C-A-C-H-E, like the cache of an animal or the cache of honey, where if your community is participating in this regenerative reciprocity with other communities, when somebody of your community travels to, say, that city, you could be rewarded through a cashback, which is generated from the goodwill which has been cultivated between the two communities through this regenerative reciprocity.
That's quite an interesting social system. What I think is really interesting here is that we're talking about designing the new sphere to create more like a propolis, and just how there's really a blue ocean here in designing for that, and how we don't have to be sort of tied to how things worked in the examples that came to mind for me, whereas like in the old world, at least in the business world, companies don't have a propolis between them. They're always elbowing each other out for market share, and they're trying to grab as much market share as possible, become monopolistic. And that competitive game it's why we have the FANG companies right now. And then you've also got cities which are sort of rivalrous with each other in a way that like maybe sports manages or something like that. And, heaven forbid, city-states sort of warring with each other in the old times. But there's literally an opportunity to build this more anti-fragile propolis between communities in leveraging the power of the internet, the coordination power of the internet, and we can all share in the fruits of that by designing it. So I think it's really a very profound observation to point out that creating this metastructure between communities will create a lot of good and a lot of anti-fragility for the world. Well, I feel like I'm really excited about what you're working on in that you've kind of got this theory of change with the Regenaissance. You've got Playdrive, which is a place in which you're kind of trying to stimulate that theory of change, and then you've got Weco and the Holonic community computer, and those kind of feel like three different legs of a tripod to me, in which you're trying to stimulate a movement. Is there any other sort of major piece of the movement that you're building that you want to tell us about? Is there anything I missed in that perception?
No.
Okay. And I'm wondering, in 5 or 10 years, if you're maximally successful, what does the world look like, and how has the world changed?
I really like this quote by Albert Camus, who says that the reason why we fight is not to generate some heaven on earth utopia. It's just to maintain the liberties which we've managed to scrape together over the generations. So hopefully by 2030, we'll live in a world which is no worse than this one as a starting point. But beyond that, I hope to see a world which has a profoundly better metabolism. A world where there is a balance between work and play. And even that places play at its centrality and sees work as a form of play, as a form of structured play. The world is pretty unfathomable in 2030. The evolution of artificial intelligence, of 5, 6, 7, 8G, of hyperconnectivity, of brain interfaces. What I hope is that by learning how to play with all of these new toys within a metagame which is trying its best to hold the playground together for everybody to be able to continue to play, while simultaneously learning from the great wisdom of the past and from learning from just the generation which is passing now, the pre-computer generation, that there are deep lessons which mustn't be forgotten, because otherwise the technology will devour us. It will devour us alive, and it will make us subservient to it, rather than it being one of the many toys in our toy box.
So what I heard there is sort of the world being pretty unfathomable itself in 5 or 10 years with all of the accelerationist technology that we've got going on right now. But sort of a want to have the technology servicing the play and not just the human servicing the technology, and sort of creating this container, this propolis for humanity to sort of be anti-fragile with each other and how we socially relate with each other in the near future. And I'm wondering, and I'm just wondering, what that brings up for you. Do you feel like we're on that track now? Do you feel like a sense of urgency to stimulate creating that adjacent possible and moving us over to that track? And sort of how you relate to that vision versus the course that you feel like humanity is on now and the course that we're on now.
Yeah. So what is it that they say? Move fast, slowly, and move slow, quickly, or both. Yeah, I would definitely commit to that.
Is that a fork of the whole Zuckerberg move fast and break things? So if we're going to be more conscious about the social change we create, it's like move fast on one level, but slowly on another level. I actually haven't heard that phrase before. I don't know that the audience has either.
Yeah, I'm not sure what its origin is. It might be that to build things or to grow things in particular, then you have to move slowly, but that you also have to be on time. You have to water when it's the right season. You have to sow the seeds when the time is right. But it feels like there are many seeds which are growing all simultaneously. But what I see lacking is this meta-coordination layer. And I feel that there's on one side, there are powerful entities who are working on meta-coordination so they can maximize their power in the world. But then there are many people involved in these regenerative movements who aren't thinking big enough, who need to think as big as possible to generate this planetary, and even at some point beyond planetary coordination layer, which for me, the global brain feels like the right metaphor, the right image. And if we don't cultivate this properly, then other people are going to do it. And their intentions are not as benevolent as we aspire to. A lot of these intentions are simply materialistic, are simply imperial, and sometimes willing to share a bit, the minimum. Here, have a little corner of the playground that you can play in every so often. But that's not what we aspire to. We aspire to an infinite game. We aspire to a feast for forever, that everybody can rejoice in the energy, in the swirl and ebb and the warp and woof of life, and relish in that, not only for the select few who are tapping right, holding the brain stem of the global brain tightly in their fist, but instead a relaxed, playful planet that can enjoy every moment in the fullness of presence in the context of a great infinite game.
Yeah, it's I mean, I think it's a beautiful vision, and I'm just, as you're speaking, I'm getting flashbacks to time when it felt like I was in flow, and in play and in resonance with my community. So I just invite the listener to think through their memories about times in which they felt that, and how can we export that to the world. So I'm left with a feeling of real hope and a sort of the beauty of your vision, but also there's kind of a pit in my stomach about just about how the metagame right now is capitalism and, the social scaffolding that for better or worse, much of humanity has to interrelate with each other. Depends on which social network they use, but for me, it's Twitter. And just the fact that Twitter causes us, and all of social media, it feels like it's generating these culture wars, where there's this thing called the race to the bottom of the brainstem, where because everything in social media is monetized with ads, and you can sell more ads when you have more eyeballs, everything is trying to keep us on site longer and more engaged longer. And so it elicits this race to the bottom of the brainstem, where everything becomes these visceral impulses, like everything reduces down to culture wars and fighting over the culture wars because we're more profitable when we're enraged, or everything kind of races to like things that are very visceral for people. Depending on what your preferences are, maybe it's like beer and boobs, or maybe it's something else depending on what your preferences are. And so it feels like almost what you're trying to engineer is a race to the top of the brainstem, to a place where the coordination metastructure doesn't care that we're more profitable when we're enraged. It it cares more about a race to the top of the brainstem where we're better off when we're in play and we're in flow with each other and with the higher angels of our nature. And so, yeah, I don't know. I'm left with two opposing feelings, and one is an appreciation for the profoundness of play and that structure, but also sort of like a cynicism about how do we bootstrap that using capitalism. And maybe that's where Web3 fits in. Maybe there's some way to bootstrap these communities from within the heart of the culture wars and social media and capitalism within it. And that's why I think it's so interesting what you're doing with We3 and Playdrive, sort of figuring out the structure to bootstrap the new metagame within the old metagame. So yeah, I'm rambling a little bit here, but I'd say, do you have any sort of relation to like that cynicism or the fact that the existing structure is so different from the structure that you envision out there? How do you deal with the dissonance between those two things?
Yeah. The challenge is that any new relationship which we try to form is simultaneously being pulled apart by the system in which we're living, and the methodology or the game plan to counter that, as far as I can tell, is to do the hard work of individual and collective trauma healing. So the kind of healing of the culture which allows us to resonate with the others in a way which transcends market conditions. And that even when market conditions get tough, when the market is trying to tear us apart, then we have the resonance, we have the propolis to fall back onto. It's definitely a huge challenge. It's the healing of the individual and the collective brainstem, so that, as you say, there can be this race to the top of the individual neocortex, which helps coordinate the individual and be present, jump on all of the opportunities for play which are present. And also this race to the neurocortex, which is going to allow us to coordinate together as a community, as a planet. But before we can get there, we need to do this healing, because otherwise you're activating a neocortex which is in service to trauma, and it's just reproducing this trauma over and over again.
Yeah. So the next edge that we're on is reducing and healing our trauma versus inducing more trauma. And so that feels like the direction that we're trying to push is to build social structures and a propolis between these communities that heals trauma and not induces new trauma. I think that might be a little bit reductionist, but that's one of the core points that I heard there.
And that's spot on.
I think that I'm really enjoying where this is going, and unfortunately we only have 8 minutes left. So I'm wondering if we could start moving into a couple of wrap-up questions. Before we do that, I'm wondering if there's anything I didn't ask that you want to tell the audience.
No.
Okay, great. Well, what would you like the audience to check out from your work? So we're gonna have a link to Weco in the show notes. We're gonna have a link to the Regenaissance paper and the Holonic community computer paper in the show notes. So if you're someone in the audience who resonates with this vision, what should they check out? What should they do? How should they get engaged in your work?
So I would invite them to come test out Weco, to start a glass bead game. So you create a post, you choose the glass bead game function, and there you can set up a game either synchronously or asynchronously to play with other people on the topic of your choosing. And as you explore the site, you'll see some interesting applications for the game. For example, we've been playing a game of tongue twisters recently, where each player takes turn to try and and speak the tongue twister, recording their mistakes as well, because otherwise, you miss out on the joy of it. And it's something which is very simple. It's something that this is on the level of rather than this profound, okay, we're trying to figure out what is our collective meaning. It's more on that lighter level of play, which is just as crucial for generating the propolis of just having fun together. And I invite you to start a game and see who else joins in. Apart from that, I'd invite you to look at the Regenaissance document, which is a long document of around 120 pages, but the essence of it is contained in the first, I would say, 5, which is the introduction, which really lays out the vision. And that context, I think, is the most important thing, the context of play that we're in, which is the context of these 10 years. And the challenge, the quest of whether we figure out how to play with these new toys in the right way, or if we let them destroy us. But then within the Regenaissance, there are many ideas and also games, a number of which have not yet been built. So if anybody reads something which they would like to build, then please reach out and get in touch. I'm at Never Say Never on Twitter, but never with a G, like Gnever, say Gnever. So you can find me there. Just DM me. And then if you resonate with what we're doing with Weco, you can read the Holos paper, which goes into more of our blockchain Web3 kind of vision. And if that resonates with you, then feel free to get in touch and come and build something with us. It's all open source. We aspire to be a cooperatively owned. James Weir has some very interesting ideas about that. And otherwise, if you're interested in exploring some of these ideas, just send me a message and we can play a glass bead game together, just the two of us, and jam on some ideas, have some fun, and see what emerges.
Yeah, beautiful place to end. We'll have links in the show notes to Playdrive, which is the event that y'all are running in June in Austria, to the Regenaissance paper, and to the Holonic community computer paper, and then also just a link to Weco, which is where you can practice it. But you can practice play anywhere, it feels like. And so I think this podcast is hopefully an invitation to practice creating a more regenerative world by playing with the people around you.
Hell yes.
Thanks so much for joining. Really enjoyed the conversation.